The First World War, sometimes known as the Great War, began in 1914. New Zealanders began volunteering for service immediately. By 1916, so many New Zealand soldiers had died that they could not be replaced by volunteers alone. So the New Zealand government introduced conscription. Men's names were drawn every month, almost like numbers in a lottery, and if your name was drawn, you became drafted. You had no choice. You had to go to war. Silas, my grandfather, was drafted into the army in 1917. He was 23 years old. But Silas believed in the Bible, and the Bible said, "Thou shalt not kill." So Silas refused to carry a gun, and he refused to fight. He became a conscientious objector. Conscientious objectors were very unpopular, and a lot of people thought that they were cowards. The government said that if fighting was against man's religion, he could go into non-combatant service instead. This could include working in hospitals, helping the wounded on the battlefield, or working in gun factories. Some conscientious objectors refused to have anything to do with war at all, and they were sent to prison. Silas chose to do non-combatant service. He joined the medical corps and trained to be a stretcher bearer. Stretcher bearers were like the modern-day paramedics or first aid workers. First, he went to a training camp at Featherston, north of Wellington, where he learnt first aid, including how to stop someone bleeding to death. He was also taught how to dig trenches and put up tents. After training, his company sailed to England. Silas was seasick for the whole journey. The men slept in hammocks hung from the roof of the hold. Silas remembered that the noises of snoring was like the sound of the sea. Because he was so sick, he could hardly eat, and he lost a lot of weight. All the time, the men were afraid that an enemy submarine might find the ship and sink it. And here are some of the training grounds at the camp in Featherston. And that is Silas in his army uniform. After more training in England, Silas was shipped off to the fighting in northern France, near a town called Bapaume. The soldiers and stretcher bearers lived in trenches dug into the mud. Food was carried to the trenches from field kitchens, but when the food arrived, it was usually cold. There were rats everywhere. Sometimes the soldiers carrying the food were shot and killed, and then there would be no food at all for several days. So there you can see some of the soldiers in trenches, those like holes in the ground. And down here are soldiers working in a field kitchen. The stretcher bearer's job was to find wounded soldiers and carry them back to safety. It was very dangerous. The German and New Zealand soldiers were fighting with machine guns and shells. Silas and the other stretcher bearers had to run with their stretchers across no man's land between the two armies. Once the bearers had found a wounded soldier, they would bandage him up and take him to an ambulance. The stretchers had no wheels, so the soldiers would need to be carried, sometimes for several kilometers. Wounded German soldiers were also carried back to the British tents to be cared for. Silas learnt German and talked to many of the German soldiers. Some of them were only 15. On one of these journeys across the battlefield, Silas himself was wounded. He and the other stretcher bearers heard the shell coming towards them. They threw themselves to the ground, but 3 of the 4 bearers were killed when the shell exploded. Silas was hit in the legs and was unable to walk. He was taken to hospital and then sent by hospital ship to England. The hospital ship had long chutes running down from the wharf into the holes in the ship's side. "Keep your head down, mate," said one of the men on the wharf. Silas lay flat and whoosh, the stretcher shot down the chute into the ship's hold. There were hundreds of wounded soldiers on board. The ship had big Red Cross symbols painted on its side in the hope that it would not be a target for enemy submarines. For a while, Silas was very ill. The army sent weekly telegrams to his mother in Christchurch with news of his progress. On the day she expected the telegrams, Silas's mother would go to the gate and wait anxiously for the postman to arrive. Eventually, Silas recovered. He returned to New Zealand in 1920. On the hills above Christchurch was a memorial for local soldiers killed in war, including some of his school friends. Later, he told his family that he cried when he saw it, thinking of his friends and the waste of war. "I cried because I was alive and they were dead." And there is what one of those hospital ships looked like. In 1914, New Zealand's population was just over 1 million. By the time the war ended in 1918, more than 100,000 New Zealanders had fought on the battlefield. A total of 18,500 New Zealanders died because of the war, and 50,000 were wounded. Maori were not conscripted until 1917, but more than 2,200 Maori joined up, and many died on the battlefield or as a result of the war. You can find out more about New Zealand's role in the First World War from these websites. So that's the Auckland Museum website and the New Zealand History website. Alright, and throughout the story you would have noticed there were a couple of words that were in bold. So here they are. It just gives you a brief description of what those words mean.